Well, I want to welcome everyone. I'm David Sheffer. I'm a professor of practice here at Arizona State University in its Washington facility, and in particular at the Leadership, Diplomacy, and National Security Lab of ASU, which is situated here in Washington. And I have many of my faculty colleagues here and my co-chair for what is called the Integrated Deterrence Speaker Series that we convene here periodically, once a month or so. And that co-chair is Lieutenant General retired Ben Freakley, who's also a professor of practice here and a leading light in the LDNS world here. I want to welcome all of you. We have students here on their spring break to enjoy Washington Week here in Washington. And this is one of the featured events of that week. We have this speaker series, and I'll introduce her in just a moment, but we have a speaker series called the Integrated Deterrence Speaker Series, which is an effort over the last, more than a year now, to try to put a focus on the interconnectedness of various forms of deterrence for particularly adversaries of the United States in particular, and how that integrated concept within our national policy and our foreign policy and our military policy gets figured out here in Washington and elsewhere in terms of military, economic, industrial, law, national will, cyberspace. How do we look at all of those particular activities from the perspective of deterring threats to US national security? And today, we proudly add to that list outer space. And that is our guest today, Dr. Esther Brimmer, who is the James H. Binger Senior Fellow in Global Governance at the Council on Foreign Relations. The Washington office is here. They're also headquartered in New York. Dr. Brimmer's career spans government, academia, and non-governmental organization leadership. Her U.S. government service includes leading U.S. policy in international organizations as the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs from 2009 to 2013. She also served on the policy planning staff from 1999 to 2000. At the Council on Foreign Relations, she is writing a book on the need for better governance mechanisms to manage expanding human activities in outer space. And she convenes the Council of Councils, which brings together 27 international affairs research organizations from 24 countries for policy analysis and discussion. Dr. Brimmer received her bachelor's degree from Pomona College and her master's and doctorate degrees in international relations from Oxford University. I had the great pleasure of working with Dr. Brimmer during part of the Clinton administration and was incredibly impressed with her then. And then, of course, I was able to watch from afar with great pride during your work in the Obama administration. And it is a distinct pleasure of mine that she's a colleague of mine at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I have a senior fellow slot there. And we share the same research associate. So and actually, you're kind of my boss at the council, is the last time I recalled. So I'm just terribly delighted to have her here with us today. She's going to give you a real insight into the challenge of developing, which she's given a lot of thought to through a task force that she just led, on how to structure US policy towards outer space, and particular parts of the equation in outer space. And that's a story that very few people actually know about. So she's going to reveal it to you today. After she speaks, we'll sit together for 5 or 10 minutes for a dialogue between the two of us, and then we'll open it up for questions. We have a good virtual audience as well, and those who are joining us virtually, just ask your questions in the chat box, And then Ashley Wright, our colleague, will write them down, bring them over to me, and I'll be able to ask questions that come in through the chat box to Dr. Brimmer. Dr. Brimmer? Nice.
Good morning, and David, thank you for that warm introduction. It is my honor to be here to talk about the governance of outer space issues. I should say one of the joys of my career has been to work with extraordinary people, and David is one of them. That you're both expertise on international law issues and on important concepts, and the important concepts that should underpin policy are crucial. There were so many times when I turned to David and learned so much from you. So it's a delight to be here with you, particularly this morning, and with all of the students and guests here in this room and online as well. I will start off talking about the work of the task force, and I will share with you both its conclusions, but also a bit some of the structure, open a variety of lines of discussion. Hopefully say something that will provoke some questions as well, and I look forward to our discussion. Let me start off by showing you and telling you what a task force report is. This is actually the hard copy. We live in such a digital world. I'll say that it, of course, is available as a PDF online, and there are various additional materials that are in the web version, but this is the actual hard copy version as well. If you're interested in those, we're going to send those to you as well. The task force is a unique product within the Council on Foreign Relations types of work. The idea is the Council puts together task forces that bring together a bipartisan group of experts, former policymakers, and business leaders or others who have insights that would be relevant for the topic at hand. The Council identifies a topic that it sees as needing decision and which would benefit from this type of input. The objective is to try to put together policy-relevant analysis and recommendations, and if possible, to do it by consensus. To again, remarkably demonstrate that rational people can try to work together to come up with recommendations for the United States. I will say that the task force is from the point of view of policymaking advice to the United States, so it does not claim that it is speaking about everything that every country would do, though it has comments along the way. As you look at the task force report, you'll see that it has 22 signatories, and you'll see a mix of people who've served in government, who are experts. It also has observers as well, and there was several senior congressional staff members, for example, who were observers. The other thing I should say, of course, is CFR, and I'm sure David knows have mentioned this as well, itself is a nonpartisan organization as well. Now, it does focus, as I say, on policy making, so it tries to look at some of the decisions to make. So it tended to discuss recommendations that then would have a decision point or an action associated with them. So I'd like to begin with some of the major issues, and then I'll go through each of the recommendations and give you some of the background related to what the finding was and what the recommendation was. Now, first, every member of the task force came to it with the view that space is extremely important and that there are outstanding benefits for human activity in space. That said, so although I will be focusing on the problems, that you should be aware that people saw that again, human engagement in space was importantly beneficial. The overarching point, I would say, of the task force report is that the United States needs unified policy that spans federal departments, and that U.S. leadership needs in this area needs to be guided by an overall strategy. There are many forms that leadership may take. Some of them may be direct diplomatic action. Sometimes it's supporting others. But the idea that this needs to be an integrated whole was underpinned the work of the task force. Also, the view that the United States has fundamental national security interests in space, again, underlined the work of the task force. And as you go through it, you'll note that the task force argues that space is important, but is also a strategic vulnerability. It notes that the United States has more strategic intelligence collecting and commercial assets in space than any other country. The report also notes, for example, that satellites are essential to U.S. national security, enabling the United States to communicate with its military forces, gather intelligence, warn of potential nuclear attack, and more. It also goes on to talk about not only the importance of satellites, but other structures such as ground stations and modes of communication. It recognized that some of the important aspects and assets related to space are on Earth as well. And it was particularly influenced by what it saw as assets being vulnerable now that China and Russia, quote, have developed means to divert, disable, or destroy them. The report notes that these include the challenges include electronic warfare and jamming, as well as direct ascent and anti-satellite missiles, which are, you will see, a recurring theme in the discussion of the task force. The task force also argued that the space is a strategic challenge and notes, of course, the increasing number of satellite payloads. It's quadrupled since 2018, and they mention over 40,000 items of space debris greater than 10 centimeters diameter now orbit the Earth. You can pick whatever size you want, as the number is increasing. The task force also argued that space is a strategic imperative, that, quote, the United States is in danger of losing its privileged position. And so that particular concern, again, underpins the voice you will hear as you read the report and the tone. Now, of course, the task force does point out that space is vital to the security of the United States and the well-being of the American people. And if you, when you go to the online version, you will see particularly some additional materials that are aimed precisely to help the informed citizen understand how important space is to daily life. There's a short video, and there's even actually two short videos again, because it's important to be able to raise in many different ways the importance of space. So there's the written document, the online document, as well as additional visual materials online as well. I'll say that's also an evolution as we think about how we spread policy ideas. We think about more ways of doing that. 5 years ago, when I led the task force on the Arctic, we just produced the hard copy. Now there are multiple ways, because it's important to contribute to the policy dialogue in however ways policymakers and the public want to hear it. Now, so that. In addition to making the point that space is vital to the well-being of American people, the task force, again, as I mentioned, notes that the citizens of the United States are more reliant on services provided by satellite companies than ever before. The report also has a sense of urgency, arguing that action needs to be taken now, and that actions not taken will shape human activity in space for decades. And it argues that leadership means not only taking initiatives, but also being active in places where space issues are raised. And that's something to keep in mind when we get to some of the international organizations portion of the recommendations of the report. As you read it, you will see that the report focuses both on space traffic management and national security. The project originally started, and I think the impetus really was concerns about global cooperation on space traffic management issues. But of course, during the course of the year, we worked through the year 2024, that the national security issues, which were of course extremely important and were there, became even more salient, particularly as you saw various activities and statements throughout the year. The report presents 7 findings and 7 recommendations. In the report itself, the findings are listed in one chapter and then the recommendations in another chapter. But for this presentation, I will do them together. So I will talk about the first finding and then its corresponding recommendation. The first finding was that U.S. leadership in space is critical to U.S. national security, to U.S. global leadership, to U.S. hard and soft power, and to the security and prosperity of the American people. The idea, as it's just, is to talk about the importance of space issues and why they merit attention at the highest level. Looking at the recommendations about ways to make space a national priority, the recommendations include, first, conscious coordination of space activities across the federal government. As again, say, making choices to help, as a conscious coordination. It calls for a space summit in the first year of a new administration. And I should say that we were working on this through 2024 and rolled it out in February 2025. And the idea is that to put forward ideas that would be valid for any administration. And the idea was that one of those was to have a space summit earlier, because that helps drive attention and coordination across the government and visibility. The report also calls for a survey. We suggested, led by the Office of Management and Budget, could be another office, but to actually survey space capacities and space issues across the federal government. Because there are different while we might talk about NASA, the Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, Department of State, there are also aspects of space that appear elsewhere, for example, in the Department of Homeland Security. So one of the ideas is to actually survey that and to use that also as a vehicle to begin greater coordination across the federal government. So you'll see sections in that section why it lays out why to do a survey. It also specifically called out supporting NASA and the Department of Commerce, and particularly on the process of the transfer of notification activities related to conjunctions from the Department of Defense to the Department of Commerce. As you know, the NOAA tracks program is central to that. They've had their challenges in the past couple of weeks we can discuss. But we identified that particularly because we think that type of transition of resources, it needs to be underpinned by legislation. And so we have points where we're saying there's specific things that, for example, Congress could do to support this recommendation. We also talk about to reassess priorities to include whether to declare key space systems to be critical infrastructure, bringing together government, industry, and experts. As many of you know, that the Department of Homeland Security and the United States overall has 16 areas that have been designated as critical infrastructure. In the past few years, there was an effort to, amongst other reviews, to consider whether space systems should be included in that. Shorthand, the answer ended up being that was not added. Space was not added to the list of the 16 aspects of formal critical infrastructure. I will say that the report recognized that there are various challenges that we can discuss if you like, but particularly that the task force thought that should be revisited. That while space is a challenge because it both has companies and it's a domain, but that thinking through what should be the relationship of the space industries to other aspects and resources and assets that are crucial to the United States was important. And so they at least revisit it as part of thinking about space security. There are various elements and reasons why the task force at least said it was worth revisiting this question. That it goes to the question of the relationship between government and industry on dealing with threats. It talks about how do you communicate best practices to defend infrastructure, and how, for example, do you promote standards of accuracy for industries working with the Department of Homeland Security. So not uncontroversial, but at least it was saying that this should be re-examined. The recommendation 2 was space traffic management is crucial to the well-being of modern human societies. It talks about the need to revitalize international leadership in space. I'll say that in that recommendation, that's where there's the discussion of the National Security Council versus the National Space Council, again saying that an administration can decide how it wants to organize it, but it needs to pick somebody within the White House who would be part of our organizing structure. Recommendation 3 is that space assets are increasingly vulnerable to attacks by China, Russia, and other potential adversaries. Not surprising, there's a section that recalls the most obvious and one of the most obvious and visible examples that Russia disabled the Viasat terminals just before its 2022 attack on Ukraine. The report also notes that global information technology infrastructure is becoming more dependent on space and on systems and companies such as Amazon, SpaceX, and others. And that as a result, that you're seeing that space systems that comprise segments of these infrastructures are also becoming vulnerable, and that you're seeing that an intersection between some of the cybersecurity threats and space threats as well. There's a section here where we also talk about the public statements by U.S. officials in 2024 and others about, quote, Russia's possible intention to deploy a nuclear weapon in space, obviously one of the most serious issues that was raised at the national level during 2024. And the report reflects on and flags for the reader that this would be an ongoing important issue to follow. We can talk about that now. But I think it's an example that even when you start off to prepare a task force report, that events happen or issues are raised or new issues come onto the agenda that you have to address. Therefore, if you look at some of the recommendations, and the recommendation, particularly under recommendation 3, the tone of the report is to fix the vulnerability problem and enhance deterrence. But then the question is how. The report talks about both deterrence, both in terms as punishment and as denial of objective, and spends probably a bit more time, I would say, in terms of denial of objective as the approach and the issues that the task force raises. The task force calls on the administration to launch a space vulnerability remediation and deterrence assessment, and it suggests several areas in which to focus. I'll just list them in particular. The task force recommends enhancing domain awareness, proliferating and widely distributing space assets to increase their resiliency, hardening space assets against various modes of attack, providing space assets with defensive capabilities, and developing replacement assets that can be deployed quickly when needed. It recognized that each of these are its own larger issue, but it was trying to indicate the sorts of issues that should be raised. A brief report can't go into all of the detail in each, but at least it was trying to suggest areas for further work and where, as its recommendations, where policymakers should start. It also, again, reinforces the importance of an integrated approach. So at various points, you'll specifically say, include the following agencies. So in this section, it talks about the importance of really a wide scope of agencies and addressing that transition includes, of course, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, the U.S. Space Force, private sector companies, and representatives of civil organizations and academic institutions. And it talks a bit about how different experts should be part of this process. There's both a public and sort of private component. Finding recommendation 4 is that China is emerging as a peer competitor, and so that the recommendation here looks at how should policy on the space issues covered be nuanced. The verb was selected intentionally. So you'll see it says sharpen policy on China and seek strategic engagement on hotline issues. Sharpen, the idea was to say that in certain areas that indeed that U.S. policy will have to be extremely focused and clear on China policy. But the focused was part of it as well. And it recognized that when working in spaces beyond national jurisdiction, that the United States will have to work with adversaries, and there'll be points where you have to, in order to deal with space traffic issues, will have to work with China and with others as well. So it does. The task force recommends that the United States must undertake, quote, a targeted space-related engagement with China on hotline communications, space traffic management, and the rescue of spacefarers in distress. The more immediate ones are the hotline issue, and as maybe you know who look at this, that at least according to news reports, there are times when the U.S. has raised potential conjunctions and gotten no answer. And so one of the questions is how to at least figure out how to have a viable channel for extremely important communication. That's an area to focus on first. But the report also raises this longer-term question about how to work with China in other areas, and it flags rescue as one of the areas where we do have a common interest. As you will know, rescue and return is one of the oldest concepts in international relations, and the argument is what decisions need to be made now on interoperability of equipment to allow rescue, for example, let's say in a litter situation elsewhere. And that's a longer term view, but that the task force was trying to flag what. So it's very practical ways of cooperation that would be beneficial to all. So again, it's targeted. It also does raise the question of whether there should be an effort to try to modify the Wolf Amendment to the NASA appropriations, which requires that NASA and the Office of Science and Technology Policy officials of the White House get clearance before they talk to their Chinese counterparts. And there are interesting views on that. We can talk about that in the question and answer. Then to say the fifth finding and recommendation was that current international organizations and treaties are ill-suited to the new realities of space activity, and no single multilateral body is designated to comprehensively manage space traffic. And this was the challenge to say, in addition to all of the issues we've identified, what international mechanisms can be used to help address these? One of the challenges of space does not have a single body that governs space issues. That's certainly not what the superpowers wanted over the decades. But now this is a question of how do you deal with the both space traffic management issues and other issues in space. So the recommendations included building on existing international regimes to improve space traffic management. Now, some in the task force thought that yes, in an ideal world, you'd start from scratch. You'd say, how would you actually build this if you didn't already have institutions? The only example we have of that is the International Civil Aviation Organization, and even then, that was after 20 years of governance in the middle of a world war. So that was extraordinary in 1944, creating that mechanism. But so the view was you need to have viable international institutions, but none of them are perfect. And we do not see it being possible to create a new institution, which would require probably a treaty. It is unlikely that it would be possible to certainly in the United States, to adopt a treaty in this area. Others might have challenges as well. So then the question is, what do you go from there? And so the task force identifies various areas. One is to build on the Artemis Accords, which, as you know, as of the end of 2024, had 53 members, which were a set of principles for good practice in space, championed by the United States, but also with input of multiple other countries. So that's one channel. Another channel is to look at the existing United Nations institutions. It focused on the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, which manages the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, based in Vienna. For a variety of reasons, the task force did not focus on the Conference on Disarmament, which is based in Geneva, and also has a slice of space issues. We can go into that question if you like. The types of things that we recommended was basically to try to make the existing institutions more agile. So the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space meets once a year. It has its plenary every June. During this time of the year, the first half of the year, its two subcommittees, the legal and the scientific subcommittees, meet and bring proposals forward. They then go to the plenary, which may then have recommendations for the General Assembly in the autumn. Which is a logical schedule, and they try to do good work. What I thought was that one of the criticisms we heard, particularly from the commercial sector, was that even on efforts they thought were useful and copious, they're not fast enough. And if you only meet once a year, that's probably true. And so one of the things we talked about was how could you have the institution meet twice a year? So the actual practical answer of that is budgetary. And so one of the notes we'll see was additional funding to actually be able to convene twice a year, and seconding staff. That one of the things that the United States does is second staff or loan staff to United Nations agencies. My bureau usually used to do that. We can talk about that, but we had some very practical ways that we thought, at least in the interim, to try to work on this. We also thought it was important to work with the International Telecommunications Union. We can talk about that as well, because of its particular role in the managing of frequencies. We also thought that in the United Nations system, that at times it would be helpful, both for the United States and China, to let others lead. So, for example, on the conference on special lunar issues, where we're about to be observers last year, it was actually Romania that took the lead on creating this working group on lunar issues. And there are times when indeed it's helpful for the superpowers to step back and say, okay, let's let someone else take the lead and bring states together. The other thing to keep in mind is so future work might be, how do we deal with space in other venues? So we see that other countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, for example, has been interested in raising space in the G20 context. And indeed, there's now a space economy leaders meeting that's part of the G20. There's a new African Space Agency. There are interesting things happening on space in multiple places. So the diplomacy of space is also changing. Recommendation 6 was that the expertise and perspective of the private sector and other non-state actors was crucial. And there are several parts of the international world where the international community needs to manage the private sector, including civil aviation, shipping and maritime issues, postal issues. And so developing a working relationship is important. And we talk about different types of models, and the report goes through different suggestions of how you might formulate commercial sector engagement in space management. Basically, think where you can borrow aspects of other agencies. And finally, the 7th recommendation was that in an era of increased competition in space, the United States may not always be the first to reach new destinations in space. Therefore, the United States benefits from the principle in the Outer Space Treaty that outer space is, quote, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, end quote. And so the task force argues that the United States should treat space as a global commons. We recognize this is not current US policy. But we actually argue that there's both the argument of it's the right thing to do. There's also the argument that it's the practical thing to do. If you're that if you are concerned about what other countries do, there may be other countries who get to a place first, such as, let's say, the southern pole of the moon, that the United States should rethink this issue. So that's one where you have both the theoretical, the legal, and the political that intersect in that particular recommendation. So, in conclusion, I'm sure we have time for our conversation and for our Q&A. The report says that we need a concerted strategy across the federal government, that we need to continue to develop ways to work constructively with the commercial sector, that we can borrow aspects of good governance and good management from other international organizations as we try to put together a framework for space. And I would suggest that it also tries to forestall further erosion of cooperation in space. Ultimately, say the underlying question is, do we go to space as one human species? If so, what does that mean? Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. That's great. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Brimmer. That is extremely helpful. It's a broad overview of literally the future and one of the most important aspects of the future, both for our policy making and, frankly, our own existence in the future. I want to follow up on just a couple of points, if I might, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We've been reintroduced in recent days, or I should say recent weeks, to the concept of territorial ambitions of major powers. And I'd like, if you could, just expand a little bit the Outer Space Treaty principle that outer space, quote, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, close quote. Will that square with the current dialogue that we see among nations about territorial ambitions? Will those territorial ambitions ultimately leap into outer space, the moon, Mars, et cetera, in our national dialogue?
Well, first, thank you for the question. I hesitate in the presence of one of our leading legal scholars to delve into this, so I answer it from a political, not from a legal expertise. But I will say that indeed, I think you will see increasing pressure on this point in the near term in a way that was not the case before, because now it is an active question with more countries having access to space. I think one of the, and particularly where I think you will see this issue is on the moon. That we now have 5 countries that have successfully landed a device on the moon. Obviously, the United States is the only country that's landed and returned human beings from the moon multiple times. But of course, the then Soviet, Soviet Union, India, China, and now Japan have all landed a device on the lunar surface. Some of those just in the past year, during the tenure of the task force. There are many other countries that are also spacefaring countries and are part of those efforts. So often those efforts are then also represent the input, let's say, of the European Space Agency and others as well. But that's by way of saying that this issue of, although the Outer Space Treaty crucially says that you are not establishing sovereignty by landing on the moon, that some countries may, in effect, begin to interpret that differently, such that there are provisions, quite understandably, even in the Artemis Accords, that talk about the preservation of historic sites. The first and most important one to the United States, obviously, is literally the place where Neil Armstrong and others landed on the moon. But there's a concern that if you are landing somewhat close, some device somewhat close to a site of historic interest of another country, that depending how close you do and how much the blast effect is, that you may actually interfere with an area that, again, is not the sovereign territory of the United States, but obviously is extremely important for historical and cultural reasons. And so I could see the concern about that. There are also certain places where multiple countries want to be. The southern pole of the moon is one of them, because there are some indications that there may be water ice in the shadow of certain craters. We will see. But that's what be highly desirable. And there again, we may see activities that seem to exclude others in tension with the Outer Space Treaty. So I think that's one area where I think we would see greater tension elsewhere as well. But I think the lunar issues is where this may become more acute.
Dr. Verma, can you expand just a bit more on the Artemis Accords? Because this was negotiated during the first Trump administration, and as I understand it, they are technically non-binding principles of conduct, but yet they do have great significance, and countries are paying attention to and embracing that set of principles, the Artemis Accords. It may be that, frankly, the future will be more governed by the Artemis Accords than perhaps the Outer Space Treaty. Could you sort that out for us?
Certainly. As you indicate, the Artemis Accords were concluded at the end of the first Trump administration, were signed in December of 2020 with 8 countries. And the idea was that there had been previous efforts to develop standards before, both in the United Nations and elsewhere. That said, the idea with the Artemis Accords was to put together a set of principles and practical points that states could use as part of good practice in space and as a mechanism for cooperation. So indeed, it is they're not legally binding, but they're sort of good housekeeping, good practical steps. And they're up online. So the idea is also it's very public, and that's important as well, that you can go and see what these states have agreed. And indeed, it's also provided at times a framework for gathering. So there have been points when the United States and others have gathered the Artemis Accords members, let's say before a diplomatic activity. And indeed, one of the things the task force suggests is that the Artemis Accords could be used for further gathering diplomatic support. That said, that it is not the only framework. The Russian Federation and China have also worked on something called the International Lunar Research Station, which is the idea and that it had certain principles that would be used for lunar activity or space activity. The challenge here is that's actually not a public document. There isn't as of at least the time we worked on the task force, that you can't go and see what are the principles to which the countries that have signed that accord have agreed. And so one of the questions is, it could be that these are wholly complementary, but the fact that that you can't compare it are part of it. It reflects one of the challenges we often face in international diplomacy, which is to what extent do we use our formal universal institutions, United Nations may be most prominent, and to what extent do we have effectively affinity groups, or groups that are subsets of the entire international community, but represent major spacefaring countries, that multiple countries are involved. India and Japan are both members of the Artemis Accords, and various countries with different interests in space are part of the Artemis Accords. One of the interesting developments was an answer to a question. Because at the beginning, when we were developing the report, one of the questions was, could you be a member of both? And indeed, when you look at the task force report, you'll see a map, and it's even easier to see when you go to the online version. But you'll see in one color for all of the members of the Artemis Accords and one color for all of the members of the ILRS, and you'd say it's, they're mostly U.S. allies and friends who are in the Artemis Accords, for example. That said, the question was, could you imagine being a member of both? And by the end of 2024, we had an answer, which was yes, because Thailand was the first country to sign both the Artemis Accords and the ILRS. And so that'll be interesting to see if other states do that. Again, if we knew what the content was of the ILRS, then we could perhaps then say, oh, that's the beginning of a global framework. It may not be that different, in which case maybe you can build a framework that's outside of our normal multilateral channels, but contributes to stability. So we'll see.
And finally, a good part of the report does focus on China and the competition and possible conflict with China, which is our top competitor in outer space at this time. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that? Are there danger signals out there with respect to China, or do we have enough of a working relationship with China on outer space to stabilize that system? Given that there's so much in outer space now, which is, I guess you call it junk or trash, satellites and stuff which are no longer operable.
Indeed, the importance of that relationship, as you say, comes through the full report. And the first is the recognition that the United States does have a peer competitor, and so that having that point understood across the policy community is important, particularly in space. There are obviously multiple other aspects that are part of this relationship here on Earth, but the fact that this is important in space, and the U.S. has been a leader in space for so long, that part of it was calling attention to that. The second was to say that in order to manage space, that there are shared interests, and that having no contact or little contact was actually dangerous. First, dangerous because obviously they're both nuclear weapons countries. There could be other effects here on Earth from misunderstandings between the two countries. I think one of the concerns was that the quality of communications between the two countries is poor on this topic. There is not a reliable hotline. Which is the term borrowed, of course, from the U.S. Soviet hotline. They're over the course of the Cold War, that there were at least certain mechanisms that were developed between the United States and the then Soviet Union. Now, in our modern era, those might look different, but I think the task force was concerned that we do not have high fidelity channels for discussing space issues, and that it is indeed conceivable that you would have conjunctions or potential collisions. Now, there are other countries where there's concern as well. Obviously, the U.S. and the Russian Federation and others are all concerned about that. But the idea was that China has multiple assets, and we don't have the structure of emergency communications that would be a good practice. So that's the main concern. Then going forward, the other interesting thing about China is that it's a qualitatively different challenge. In that during the Cold War, it was very much a strategic and military challenge for understandable reasons. However, China also has a commercial sector. Now, each commercial sector is a bit different. We do that somewhat differently, but that said, that there is important expansion in the Chinese commercial sector. And again, how both countries are going to work on that is important. And indeed, in fact, I just pulled up the news story of the day. We just had the latest launch of additional satellites for one of the Chinese global networks that's mentioned in the report, and just put up 18 more satellites. Again, it's very possible, but if you have that satellite network is expected to have 14,000 satellites. Again, how are you going to manage the numerous satellites that U.S. companies are putting up, the Chinese companies are putting up? So the U.S.-China relationship is important on the strategic, military, and economic fronts, making it more interesting and complicated and important.
It sounds almost as if in the 50s we built the interstate highway system, and now we have to build an interspace highway system for all of the satellites. Let's open it up from our audience and online. Yes. We've got a mic coming for you. This is Hunter. Oh, let's go with Hunter first. I saw him, and then.
My ear, actually.
Oh, okay. All right, very good.
It's like an
Very good.
auction, if you can move it.
No.
Okay.
I don't know a ton about space, but I've been.
Would you introduce yourself again?
Oh yeah, I'm Lily.
Mhm.
I'm a PDS student, an LENS lab fellow. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about your thoughts on the Iron Dome.
Oh,
On the Iron Dome.
on the Iron Dome. So, on the.
I'm sorry.
No, please.
For Israel or the United States, or what part of the Iron Dome are you?
Just in general.
Oh, in general.
Right. And so, Joe.
What I was reading is Trump recently just put it in place for the U.S. to kind of.
He raised it. He raised the issue. So just for the group as a whole, that Iron Dome is the nickname for one of the security measures for the state of Israel that shoots down incoming missiles. Many people here will correct me and get it more precise, but the issue is to say it is a mechanism. It defends the territory of Israel, which is the size of the state of New Jersey. And so one of the issues is such a mechanism conceivable for a continental sized country? That's even before you get to the arms control issues about how this might affect other strategic issues. I should say first that, of course, this issue came up really after the task force wrote its report, so it does not formally comment on that. But I would just say, if you're asking Esther what she thought, as opposed to what, because the task force itself did not comment on this issue, that I think that managing the safety of the United States is a integrated strategic issue. And so the question is, how would even what's actually being talked about, my point earlier about it's a very different thing to be talking about, a very different type of structure if you're looking at this, the entire United States. But then the question is also, how does that relate to other aspects of national security choices and strategic choices? And a decision of that magnitude has implications for everything else. So it's something where we'd have to say, what is really meant? And it has implications in so many other aspects of security.
Next question. Yes, let's go first to our student here. Yes. Right here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tigist. I'm not a student, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's fine.
You look so young.
Yeah, I'll take it as a compliment. I'm actually a professor at Howard.
Oh, okay.
And former UN staff. I was a senior advisor with the UN. So I have two questions. Thank you, doctor, for the very interesting topic. So I have two questions. The first one is, I know you talked about a lot, but given the rapid increase in satellite launches by private companies, what specific measures can the United Nations and the US implement to enhance specific traffic management, in particular in effectively mitigating space debris risks? I read about it a while ago, like there are 120 million something debris in orbit alone. So I was curious if you could say a few things about that. The second question is on collaboration with academic institutes. For instance, can you share some successful examples of collaboration between, for instance, UN and again academic institutes on space security initiatives, and how can the US further leverage university research to support global safety, global space safety efforts? So if you could say these things. So as you can imagine, I'm interested because I have two hats. I'm academic / consultant. So thank you.
Certainly. Thank you for the questions. First, the question of UN agencies and working with, you're saying working with how they might work within the United Nations system. I think a couple different things. The first off is that the functioning of the Outer Space Treaty, that's ultimately for the United Nations agencies to support. And so I think one of the things that the UN agencies can help doing, particularly if I'm thinking of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and particularly the office, that manages that, is helping states meet their commitments under the Outer Space Treaty. First, it'll probably take encouragement from other governments for the remaining countries to actually sign. And I would add in the other major treaties that whether it's with liability or the rescue and return, that trying to have all countries sign and abide by the treaties is helpful. One of the things that the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs does is it helps countries meet their obligations. And again, information sharing is important. Saying, okay, now you've signed this. This is how the sorts of information you need to provide. Of course, one of the things that it also does is that it keeps the launch record. And there again, encouraging states to actually use it. I mean, the big spacefaring countries show up. Of course, the United States shows up and says, okay, this is the list of launches. Everyone should be doing that so that it was clearer. And those are things where, again, it's important to have the global body doing that. It's not that you're supporting the U.S., that you're supporting China, or you say this is part of good governance. And so those are some things I think are helpful in terms of working in these areas. Also, private companies can contribute by contributing expertise and other private companies, universities, and others. And so this is where the channel. So, for example, I mentioned that the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space meets once a year and has two subcommittees that meet. One on legal issues. You said you probably know everyone who's on that one, and then one on space and scientific issues. Though there are private sector advisors to those. Many of them, and this is particularly a good role for the academic community. Again, we're experts in certain areas, can be part of informing those delegations, and that's really helpful because the offices are small. So any help is useful, and so there's real ways for the academic community to contribute to that, and talk about as a collaboration of particular institutes. Did I get your second question? You will need both, but you will need both member governments to want to work on it. That said, there are aspects where there's sort of points of intersection where international cooperation or international governance is possible. So, for example, it's the International Telecommunications Union, again, one of our oldest international organizations going back to the telegraph era. It, of course, allocates frequencies for geo orbit, and the ability to, and that, in a sense, is the frequency is a limited asset, and so we recognize that we need to manage it as a limited asset. We may think a few other points where that's.
We had a question over here.
Hi, I'm Scott Smaz, a staff member with the ASU Space Science and Technology Initiative, ASU New Space. Very wonderful, excellent talk, very illuminating, very timely. I was reading the report, flight out. Couple of things, with the advent of hypersonics, is how would you, do things differently? Now that we have some conversations about satellites we aren't having, as hypersonics start to emerge, how can we create the conversation for interoperability or notification, tangentially. And then also, with your thoughts about a space summit, would there's literally a space conference a week. Is there perhaps versus a dedicated summit, is there tangentially ways to insert the needs into the plethora of opportunities that are available to us and some of the other, can the council integrate better with some of the other trade associations that host conferences, satellite, SAIA, AIAA, those types of things.
Can I supplement that question by asking, Esther, did the former administration, does perhaps the current administration have one or two individuals who do float through all of these meetings and make it a point to know when they're being held, and if not to be on the panels, to at least be in the audiences, so that there's an administration official who is absorbing, if not participating, in this plethora of meetings?
So let me tell you the question. Your question about hypersonic is very interesting. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you yet. That's distinctive. And I think it's always important to say, I don't have a good answer for you yet. I will think about that, and try, because that's a really interesting question. I want to give you a serious answer. Let me turn to the space summit. But the purpose here was also to make the point about a unified federal approach. And so the idea of a summit was one summit hosted at very senior level with federal officials that highlights what the priorities are and says, these are going to be the main areas of energy, to try to focus some of that effort. Because as you say, there are lots and lots and lots of conferences. But the idea of having something where you say, but this will actually directly lead into policymaking, and you're having one, and you expect the senior-most officials to show up, that I think would be distinctive and different than what's already occurring. And that picks up on your point, David, in that I would say that actually, from what I have seen, the answer is no. That we do not have, let's say, one or two officials who appear, or at least try to form a connection between multiple areas. One could, but then that goes back to both, for example, do you create a national space, do you keep the National Space Council? Do you have an NSC-led effort? Do you have, or do you pick one of the agencies to do that? The task force didn't raise that specifically, but effectively, that's the sort of thing that would be consistent with this idea that you need a concerted policy, because, that you're having conversations in different channels, and that isn't always necessarily being coordinated as well as it might be.
Ashley, do we have anything from online or not? Not yet? Okay, let's take, we have time for one more question, perhaps two, but let's, from the back, we've got a hand raised.
Yeah, I was wondering, this is, I guess, kind of optimistic, but is there provisions for a worst case scenario being, let's say, Russia, China, or any nation were to start claiming space territory, and this causes a cascading effect of other nations doing the same? Would the US continue to uphold the Outer Space Treaty, or would we consider also beginning to claim territory to counteract all these other states?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it would depend on what the context is and how it's happening, what they've said, and what they would do about it. Because depending on how that occurs, that the U.S. may respond in a diplomatic statement to get everyone else to agree that this is wrong, and we will do the following things to punish you because you're doing something that we think is wrong. Or it could be there may be actions you take in terms of withholding information or withholding other support, again, to try to limit the behavior of the states who are doing that. So again, it depends on the context, because one of the interesting things is that the response doesn't have to be in the same domain. So it could be that the claims are being made in space, but you find good things on Earth to then say, this is the cost we'll impose for you. Now, different administrations, various administrations may take a different view, but I would say in the long view, and I think it's important to take, for the United States to take the long view, that we've been around for decades and decades and decades, decades, decades working on these issues, not to be short-sighted. And the part of this goes back to, in the long term, the U.S. has benefited from rulemaking. It's usually part of the rulemaking, and it's benefited from order. Disorder is usually not helpful and is often dangerous. So I would suggest that in the long term, managing order is much better.
I'm afraid we have to close there because of our time, unless I think we're fine. Well, one last question. Yes, please, go ahead. Yes. I think we need your mic right in front of you, right there, right like this, yeah.
I think you have to turn it on so they can get it on the
Yeah. Karina Grigorian, and my question is, what role does AI and automation play in securing space assets, and how do you prevent AI from becoming a security risk itself?
That is an enormous question, possibly the next task force.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Certainly a full course. But I would say that, again, I'm not an expert in AI, so as I say, I'm always want to say, not my area of expertise, because there are people who are working very seriously on the management of AI issues, and so I wanted to turn you to them. Some of my colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations are working on AI management, so if you go onto the webpage, you'll see some of their discussions on space. But I'll say generally, ultimately, the source of governance is the human mind. And that's where the choices start, that then influence how we use the technology around us. And so the question would be, what are we concerned about? Which issues do we identify? And then how do we solve it? But I think that's a larger question for experts who are really focusing on AI.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rimmer. Let's give her a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you to everyone in the audience. Really appreciate it. And I appreciate that.
Oh my god, I spilled. I didn't even realize I spilled. What's wrong with me? thing.